The courtroom was quiet, an eerie silence that seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on the judge, a seasoned man known for his sharp tongue and cold demeanor. He gazed down at the young black teen standing nervously before him, eyes lowered. In shame, a slight tremor in his hands. The judge smirked, leaning back in his chair as he made a mocking remark, his words dripping with condescension. The teen, barely old enough to drive, stood there in disbelief. But what the judge didn't know was that someone in the audience was watching closely, someone whose very presence would change everything. As the judge continued to taunt and belittle, a hushed whisper ran through the courtroom. The teen's mother, the woman who had fought tirelessly for justice, was no ordinary figure. She had seen the worst of prejudice and discrimination, but had never backed down. And now her presence in that courtroom would force the judge to confront not just his own biases, but the truth of his actions. What he didn't realize was that in mocking this young man, he had crossed a line that was about to be exposed. The courtroom was stark and unwelcoming, its cold walls a silent witness to countless battles for justice. Some won, others lost. The long wooden benches, polished to a dull shine, creaked under the weight of anticipation. The floor was a dull gray tile, and the smell of ink and paper lingered in the air like a reminder of the bureaucracy that governed life here. Above, the flag of the nation hung, still and silent, its folds as stiff as the emotions of those who entered these doors. Today, however, there was something different in the atmosphere, a tension that made the air feel thick, as if even the room itself knew what was about to unfold. Standing near the defendant's table was Marcus, a 17-year-old black teen with a quiet strength that belied the fear running through his veins. His dark skin glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights, his features sharp and proud, a stark contrast to the uncertainty etched on his face. Marcus had been raised in a neighborhood where dreams often collided with harsh realities, where promises of a brighter future seemed distant, almost unreachable. Yet somehow he had managed to defy those odds. He was the first in his family to finish high school, and even though he had always dreamed of a career in technology, he found himself caught in a system that seemed hell-bent on holding him back. Marcus wasn't just any teenager. He was a product of a generation that had learned early on that life wasn't fair, that appearances mattered, and that being black in a world built on biases often meant being judged before you even spoke a word. But what Marcus lacked in privilege he made up for with grit. His mother, Sheila, had instilled in him the belief that no matter how many doors were slammed in his face, there was always a way to rise above it. She had raised him alone, her struggle to make ends meet a constant reminder of the world's indifference to their struggles. Despite her exhaustion, Sheila's determination had shaped Marcus into a young man with a fierce sense of justice. Today, Marcus wasn't just standing in a courtroom. He was standing at the crossroads of his future, and his family's hope rested on him. His case wasn't about an isolated incident. It was about a system that had long treated people like him as less than, less intelligent, less capable, less worthy of respect. He had been falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit. It was the kind of accusation that could destroy a young man's life, and he knew it. But what Marcus didn't know was that this trial would become something much bigger, something that would force the people in this room to confront not just his innocence but the very foundation of the biases that had shaped their perceptions. His attorney, an experienced but overworked lawyer named Karen Mitchell, had been working tirelessly on his case. She had grown up in a world where privilege often spoke louder than truth, but something about Marcus's story resonated with her. She saw in him the same drive that had led her to law school, the same determination to rise above the limitations set by others. Karen was one of the few people in Marcus's life who had ever treated him as an equal, as someone with potential, not a statistic. Her presence in the courtroom was a small but significant force in his corner, but even she knew the odds were stacked against them. Sheila sat in the back of the courtroom, her gaze fixed on her son, her heart heavy with a mixture of pride and fear. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the knuckles white from the grip. Sheila had been through so much in her life: poverty, racial prejudice, and a system that seemed designed to push people like her into the shadows. But she had fought for every inch of progress, and her fight for her son's future was no different. She had seen the way people looked at Marcus. She had felt the weight of their judgments even when they didn't speak a word. But she had also seen his resilience, his ability to rise above the hate and ignorance that sought to define him. Her heart ached as she watched the judge, a man who had built his career on making decisions that impacted lives but who seemed blind to the real-world consequences of his words and actions. Judge Thompson was a man of privilege, one who had spent decades in the system, who saw his role as that of a protector of order rather than a seeker of truth. He was known for his quick temper, his inability to listen, and his deep-seated biases, which many in the community had whispered about but few dared to confront. The trial had started as any other, slow and methodical, the constant shuffle of papers, the echoing clack of shoes on the tile floor, the monotonous drone of legal jargon. But as the case against Marcus unfolded, it became clear that something much darker was at play. The accusation against him was flimsy at best, a story built on assumptions and stereotypes. And yet, despite the lack of evidence, the judge's attitude was dismissive, as though he had already made up his mind before hearing the facts. The tension in the courtroom grew with each passing moment, the walls closing in on Marcus. He felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him, the doubt in the judge's glare, the judgment in the whispers of the audience. But he also felt something else, a flicker of hope. Somewhere, deep inside, he knew that the truth had to come to light. He just didn't know how. In the back of the room, Sheila's eyes met Karen's, and for a brief moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. This was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for their dignity, for Marcus's future, for the chance to be seen for who he truly was, not the label others tried to place on him. They both knew the stakes, and though the road ahead seemed uncertain, they also knew that no matter what happened, they would never back down. But the true challenge was yet to come, and it would come in the form of a single, momentary lapse in judgment, a lapse that would change everything. The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of voices, the tension rising like a thick fog. Judge Thompson sat at his bench, his gaze unrelenting as he skimmed through the papers in front of him. He didn't even bother to look up as Marcus's attorney, Karen Mitchell, presented her case. It was clear from the start that he wasn't interested in hearing her arguments. His posture was stiff, as though his mind had already been made up. Marcus's fate seemed to hang on the judge's whims, and no matter how carefully Karen crafted her defense, Judge Thompson's disdain for the young black teen before him remained palpable. "Your Honor," Karen said, her voice steady, "the evidence here does not support the charges against my client. He's innocent, and we have proof that—" The judge interrupted her with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you've said that before. The evidence is inconclusive at best. And frankly, I'm not sure how much longer we need to drag this out." The words stung, but Karen didn't back down. She knew how much was at stake for Marcus, how much his family depended on this outcome. She clenched her fists beneath the table, trying to steady herself. The injustice of it all was suffocating, but she was determined to fight until the very end. Marcus sat silently, his heart pounding in his chest. Every time the judge spoke, it felt like another blow to his spirit. He had been through so much in his young life, facing prejudice at every turn, watching his mother work herself into the ground just to make ends meet, hearing the whispers behind his back. But he had never felt this small, this helpless, this invisible. "Your Honor, if I may," Karen continued, her voice firm, "this is about more than just the evidence. This is about the systemic bias that runs through the very fabric of our justice system. It's about how a young black man can be accused of something he didn't do simply because of the color of his skin." The judge's face hardened. "I'm not interested in your social commentary, Ms. Mitchell. I'm here to make decisions based on the law, not some emotional appeal. Let's focus on the facts." The words cut deep. Karen could feel the weight of his dismissal pressing down on her, but she refused to give up. She had seen this before, the way the system could be so blind to its own prejudices, the way it could turn a blind eye to the suffering of those who didn't have the right skin color, the right connections, or the right opportunities. But The judge wasn't the only obstacle Marcus and Karen faced. Across the room in the audience sat the prosecutor, a slick and confident man named Edward Reynolds. He had a reputation for winning cases at all costs, even if it meant bending the truth to suit his narrative. He had barely spoken during the proceedings, choosing instead to sit back with a smug smile on his face, as though he already knew how this was going to end. But it wasn't just his presence that weighed heavily on Marcus. It was the quiet but ever-present belief that Reynolds saw him as nothing more than a pawn in a game, a symbol of the broken system that was so easily manipulated. The tension between Karen and the prosecutor was palpable, each of them knowing the other's strengths and weaknesses. Karen had the truth on her side, but Reynolds had the system, and in a courtroom like this, the system often won. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," the prosecutor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'm not sure what world Ms. Mitchell is living in. The evidence clearly shows that my client," he nodded toward the victim's family, "was harmed by this individual. And yet here we are with the defense clinging to some fantastical notion of racial bias. Let's focus on what really matters, shall we?" Karen's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. "What really matters is that an innocent young man is being railroaded because of his skin color, and that is something we can't ignore." The prosecutor's smile widened. Of course, the old race card. How predictable. The words were a slap in the face, but Karen knew that this was part of the game. Reynolds was trying to provoke her, to throw her off her game. But she wouldn't let him. She had come too far, fought too hard, to back down now. The courtroom fell into a tense silence, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. The judge's gavel slammed against the wood. "I've heard enough for today," he declared, his voice cold. "We will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements. This court is adjourned." As the room emptied, Marcus felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. The judge hadn't even acknowledged the flaws in the case against him. It was as though his fate had already been sealed before he even stepped foot in this room. Karen walked over to him, her face tense but determined. "Marcus, we're not done yet," she said, her voice low but reassuring. "I know it looks bad, but I promise you we're going to keep fighting." Marcus nodded, though the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. "I just don't get it," he said softly. "Why does it feel like no one cares?" Karen placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "It's not that no one cares," she said. "It's that the people who need to care don't want to. They're blinded by their own biases, their own beliefs, but that's why we're here, to make them see." In the back of the courtroom, Sheila stood frozen, her eyes locked on the judge. She had heard the condescending tone in his voice, the way he dismissed her son's life as though it meant nothing. It made her blood boil. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, for this man to treat Marcus like some criminal. She knew that Marcus had done nothing wrong. But she also knew that in a world like this, justice wasn't always served on a silver platter. It was something you had to fight for, and sometimes you had to fight harder than anyone thought possible. But as she stood there, fists clenched at her sides, a new resolve began to grow within her. If they thought they could break her son, they were wrong. And if they thought they could silence her, they were even more wrong. Sheila wasn't about to let this system swallow Marcus whole. As the room cleared, the rising tension was palpable. Every person in that courtroom could feel it. What had started as a simple trial was beginning to spiral into something much bigger. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about a community's fight for dignity, a mother's fight for her son, and a nation's reckoning with its deep-seated injustices. And it was only just beginning. The courtroom felt smaller today, suffocating even. The air was thick with unspoken words, the weight of the past few days hanging over everyone present like a storm cloud. The hardwood floor beneath Marcus's feet seemed to groan in protest with every step he took, and the smell of stale paper and ink filled his nostrils. He could hardly focus on the legal jargon flowing from Karen's mouth as she made her closing statements. Every word felt distant, muffled by the echo of his own thoughts, his heart pounding in his chest. His body was tense, but not from the weight of the trial. It was the weight of a truth he hadn't fully understood until now. The system wasn't just broken. It was built to work against him, against people like him from the very beginning. It had never been about whether he was innocent or guilty. It had always been about the color of his skin, the assumptions people made the moment they looked at him. He was just a teenager. But to them, he was a threat, a statistic, a label. And yet, here he was, still standing. In the back of the courtroom, Sheila watched her son, her heart torn in two. She had never imagined this moment, never imagined that her son, the boy she had raised with love and sacrifice, would be caught in a fight for his future in this way. Her body trembled, but not from fear, from anger, from the raw, aching injustice of it all. The judge had dismissed Marcus's innocence with a wave of his hand. The prosecutor had painted him as a criminal, as if his very existence was a threat. But she wasn't backing down. Karen's voice cut through Marcus's reverie, drawing him back to the present. This isn't just about the facts of this case. This is about what's happening all over this country. It's about how people who look like Marcus are treated, differently from the moment they're born. How their futures are determined not by their potential but by the color of their skin. The words hung in the air, sharp and raw, a moment of clarity that pierced through the noise. For a split second, the courtroom felt quieter than it had ever been, as though the weight of Karen's words had hit everyone with the force of a tidal wave. Marcus turned to look at her, seeing the fierce determination in her eyes. She wasn't just fighting for him. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been oppressed, marginalized, and overlooked. But even with Karen's impassioned plea, the battle wasn't over. The judge hadn't budged. The prosecutor hadn't wavered. And for Marcus, that unyielding resistance felt like a storm he couldn't escape. The judge, his face stern and unfeeling, turned to address the room. "I've heard all the arguments. I'm sure we're all tired of hearing the same things over and over. It's time for this court to reach a decision." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had been hoping, praying, that something would change, that somehow the system would see him for what he truly was, a young man with dreams, with potential, with the right to be treated fairly. But now, as the gavel hovered above the bench, he knew deep down that the decision had already been made. He wasn't going to win this fight. But then something unexpected happened. The door to the courtroom opened and all eyes turned. A woman entered, her presence commanding and powerful. It was Sheila. She had been quiet until now, sitting in the back, fighting to keep her emotions in check. But now, something in her snapped. She couldn't sit there any longer, watching her son being crushed under the weight of a system that refused to see him as anything but a threat. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, cutting through, the tension like a blade. Every person in the room held their breath as she reached the center of the courtroom. The judge's eyes widened in surprise. The prosecutor stiffened, his smug expression faltering for the first time. "Your Honor," Sheila's voice rang, out clear and unyielding. "I need to speak." For a moment there was silence. The judge stared at her, his gaze cold, but he didn't interrupt. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. "I've sat in the back of this courtroom listening to everything that's been said. I've watched my son be torn apart by lies and assumptions, and I can't sit quietly anymore," Sheila continued, her voice trembling but strong. "My son isn't a criminal. He's not a thug. He's not a danger. He's a child, a teenager with dreams. Dreams that have been crushed over and over again by people who can't see past their own prejudices. You see, this isn't just about Marcus. It's about all of us. It's about every single black person who has ever been treated like they didn't matter, like their lives weren't worth anything. And it's about time someone said something about it." Tears welled up in Sheila's eyes, but her voice never wavered. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on her. The judge, the prosecutor, even Karen, They all watched her with a mixture of disbelief and awe. Sheila wasn't just fighting for her son anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been forgotten by the system. The judge finally spoke, though his voice was tight, clearly shaken by the raw power of Sheila's words. "Ms. Williams, this is highly irregular. You're disrupting the proceedings." "I don't care," Sheila replied, her gaze unwavering. "This is my son, and this is a system that has failed him, failed us for too long. It's time we made them see the truth." The room was electric, charged with emotion. Marcus's heart raced in his chest, the words he had been struggling to find for so long now coming from his mother's mouth. He wanted to speak, to stand with her, but he felt rooted to the spot, as though the gravity of the moment had him in a vice grip. Then, something else shifted. The door opened again, and another figure stepped into the room. This time, it wasn't another lawyer or a member of the prosecution. It was someone from the audience, someone Marcus hadn't noticed before. A quiet, unassuming man who had been sitting near the back. But now, as the man stepped forward, the room fell into complete silence. "I think it's time we all heard the truth," the man said. His voice was steady, authoritative, "and I think it's time the court sees things from a different perspective." He looked directly at the judge, then at Marcus, then at the prosecutor. Slowly, he began to speak, revealing something that no one in the room had expected. A letter, a sworn statement, a piece of evidence that had been buried, hidden, ignored. It was the key to Marcus's innocence, something that would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Marcus had been in the right place at the right time, and that the entire case against him was built on lies. The courtroom erupted into chaos, the noise deafening. Sheila's tears flowed freely now, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of triumph. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the truth was about to prevail. And in that moment, Marcus understood something that he had never fully realized before. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. But as long as there were people like his mother, like Karen, like this stranger who had stepped forward with the truth, there would always be hope. And hope, in the end, was stronger than any system that sought to keep them down. The courtroom descended into a flurry of activity, the sound of shuffling papers and murmured conversations creating an almost surreal atmosphere. The man who had stepped forward, holding the critical piece of evidence, was swiftly approached by a team of lawyers, his identity and role in this whole ordeal still unknown to most. Marcus sat there, stunned, barely able to process what had just happened. He glanced over at his mother, who had a look on her face that mixed disbelief and overwhelming relief. Sheila stood tall, her gaze never leaving the man who had spoken up. She was trying to take it all in, trying to understand how one unexpected act of courage could completely shift the course of her son's future. The man had saved them, had saved Marcus. "Your Honor," the prosecutor, Edward Reynolds, began, his voice now uncharacteristically nervous. This is highly irregular. I demand to know who this man is and how he obtained this evidence. This is not how the system operates. We need to investigate his sources." "We will," the judge interjected, his voice firm, but strained. His eyes darted between the pieces of paper in front of him, glancing at the statement the man had handed over. "But the evidence is here, and it cannot be ignored." The room held its breath as the judge carefully examined the document. The silence was deafening, and as minutes dragged on, the tension became nearly unbearable. Sheila's eyes stayed, locked on Marcus, their unspoken communication a reflection of the relief beginning to settle in their hearts. For the first time in days, Marcus felt like a weight was lifting off his chest, a crushing burden he had carried for so long finally easing. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge looked up from the evidence, his voice soft but steady. "I have reviewed the new evidence, and it is clear that the case against Marcus Williams cannot stand. The charges are dismissed." It felt like the world had stopped turning. Marcus's body went numb, and he stared blankly at the judge, not fully comprehending what he had just heard. The weight of the words sunk in only slowly, and for a moment it felt as though the entire room was suspended in time. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't argue with the evidence, couldn't dismiss it. His professional reputation, his career, and the very credibility of his case were suddenly in jeopardy. He stood there, stunned and defeated, unable to speak. And then Sheila moved. She stood and walked toward Marcus, her hands shaking, her heart racing. She didn't know if it was from joy or exhaustion, but as she reached her son, she pulled him into a tight embrace. "Mom, I can't believe it," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I thought it was over." Sheila held him tighter, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's never over, Marcus. Not as long as we keep fighting. We've been fighting for you. And now you get to live." Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes, the emotional release finally coming, the wave of fear and uncertainty washing away with every sob. It had all seemed so hopeless before, but now there was freedom. His future, once a mere thread, was suddenly untangled and full of possibility. The man who had brought the evidence forward, still nameless to the room, stood at the back, watching the scene unfold. He felt a sense of pride well up in him as he observed the relief on Marcus's face, the smile slowly beginning to break through Sheila's tear-streaked expression. This was more than just one person's victory. This was the moment when the system was forced to reckon with its own flaws, when the truth was no longer buried under the weight of prejudice and false accusations. The judge turned his attention back to the room, clearing his throat. "I understand the weight of this case. I understand that this court has failed in its duty to treat all individuals with fairness and respect. But today, we've seen how the truth can still come to light even when it seems impossible. The justice system is not perfect, but it must always strive for accountability." Marcus, still holding his mother, looked up at the judge, his emotions raw and turbulent. He had heard those words, had seen this moment unfold, but it still felt surreal. "Does that mean I'm free?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The judge's gaze softened. "Yes. You're free, Marcus. You are free." As the judge's words echoed in the room, the air seemed to shift. The weight that had once crushed Marcus's spirit now felt lighter. He had been on the precipice of losing everything, his future, his dignity, his life, and yet somehow, through sheer will and the help of those who had fought for him, he had been given a second chance. The prosecutor, still standing frozen, finally managed to collect himself, his face flushed with the sting of defeat. He couldn't change the outcome, couldn't take back the lies and manipulation he had used to try to destroy Marcus's life. All he had left was his pride, which was crumbling in the face of truth. "Court is adjourned," the judge declared, slamming the gavel down with finality. The room began to empty, but Marcus and Sheila remained, standing together, hands still, clasped tightly. Marcus's eyes were wet with tears, but there was a spark in them, a glimmer of hope that had been absent for so long. Sheila watched her son, the boy she had raised, the boy she had always known was destined for greatness, and she realized something profound. This wasn't just a victory for Marcus. This was a victory for everyone who had ever been denied justice, for every person who had been silenced, overlooked, or made to feel invisible, for every black man and woman who had ever been unjustly treated by a system that refused to see them as human. This was their victory, too. "You did it, Marcus," Sheila said softly, the pride in her voice thick. "You never gave up, and now you get to keep going." Marcus looked up at her, his voice full of gratitude and awe. "No, Mom, we did it. We didn't give up." In that moment, the courtroom faded into the background. It was no longer a place of fear, of judgment. It had become a symbol of perseverance, a symbol of justice, a place where hope had won. As they walked out of the courtroom, hand in hand, Marcus felt the weight of his past slipping away. For the first time in a long while, he felt free. Free to dream, to live, to be more than the system's stereotype. And as they stepped out into the bright light of the world beyond those doors, Marcus realized that the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The fight for justice, the fight for equality, the fight for dignity. But now, at least, he was no longer fighting alone. The courtroom may have offered a temporary moment of victory for Marcus and his family, but the struggle they faced transcended the walls of that one building. The case was never just about one teenager's fight for justice. It was emblematic of a far-reaching, deeply embedded issue within society that affected entire communities. The truth that had been unearthed in Marcus's case wasn't just a victory for him. It was a clarion call for systemic change, a reminder that the work needed to dismantle the biases, prejudices, and inequalities built into the justice system had only just begun. Marcus's experience isn't unique. His case is one of thousands, perhaps millions, where individuals, especially Black and other marginalized communities, are judged not by the facts of their circumstances, but by preconceived notions rooted in race, class, and social status. The history of racial inequality in the United States and many other countries is long and painful, woven into the very fabric of the justice system. In the case of Black Americans, their lives have often been reduced to stereotypes: criminal, dangerous, or inferior, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The recent surge in racial justice movements such as Black Lives Matter has shed light on the alarming number of instances where Black people are wrongfully incarcerated, disproportionately convicted, or unjustly treated by law enforcement. For Marcus, the trial wasn't just a legal battle, it was a confrontation with a system that had long since written him off, a system that saw him first as a threat and second as a person. The assumption of guilt based on skin color is not just a cultural bias. It is embedded in every institution: education, employment, healthcare, and of course the justice system. It affects every aspect of a person's life, whether they are aware of it or not, and it shapes their future opportunities, or lack thereof. This systemic racism isn't just the result of individual prejudice or overt hatred, although those things still exist. It's a product of laws, policies, and practices that have been shaped over centuries, inherited from a legacy of slavery, segregation, and oppression. From the moment Marcus was born, he was at a disadvantage, treated differently, profiled, assumed guilty before proven innocent, simply because of the color of his skin. To understand the depth of the problem Marcus faced, we must look at history. The United States as a nation was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. This history of oppression has cast a long shadow, one that continues to shape the experiences of Black people to this day. The criminal justice system in particular has been a tool used to maintain racial hierarchies. The war on drugs, for example, disproportionately targeted Black communities, despite the fact that drug use was statistically no higher among Black people than white people. This led to mass incarceration, with Black Americans being incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans. According to the NAACP, Black people represent 13% of the U.S. population, but account for approximately 40% of the prison population. This unequal treatment doesn't stop once someone is incarcerated. The moment a Black person is arrested or charged, they are already facing an uphill battle. Bail is often set higher for Black defendants compared to white defendants with similar charges. Public defenders are overburdened, leading to inadequate representation, which disproportionately affects people of color. Studies have shown that Black defendants are more likely to receive longer sentences and are more likely to be wrongfully convicted. This bias doesn't only manifest in the courtroom. It begins long before a person even enters the justice system. Black children, particularly young men, are often treated as adults by the legal system, and the assumptions made about their behavior, their intentions, and their potential are influenced by decades of social and cultural biases. Studies show that Black children are perceived as older and less innocent than their white peers, even at very young ages. This was the invisible weight that Marcus carried with him as he stood before the judge. His very existence had been criminalized, and the color of his skin was more than just a physical trait. It was the lens through which his every action was viewed. Cultural leaders and historians have long spoken out about these systemic inequities. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. His words, though spoken decades ago, still ring true. The fight for racial justice is not confined to individual acts of bigotry, but is embedded in systems and structures that affect everyone, regardless of race. His call for nonviolent protest and civil disobedience in the 1960s is still a guiding principle for modern movements like Black Lives Matter. Bryan Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and author of Just Mercy, has dedicated his life to fighting the injustices faced by marginalized communities within the criminal justice system. He argues that mass incarceration is not simply a matter of crime, but of systemic inequality and racial prejudice. His work has revealed the stark reality of how the justice system fails people of color, often condemning them to a life of incarceration based on skewed legal practices. Stevenson once said, "The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice." For him, true justice isn't just about individual legal victories. It's about structural reform, about changing the very systems that perpetuate racial inequality. Dr. Angela Davis, a scholar, activist, and former member of the Black Panther Party, has also spoken extensively about the criminal justice system's role in maintaining racial oppression. She points out that the rise of the prison industrial complex is a continuation of racial slavery, one that disproportionately impacts Black communities. Prisons do not disappear social problems, she has said. They disappear human beings. Davis's work calls for not only reforming the criminal justice system, but for rethinking what true justice means in a society that has long dehumanized its marginalized groups. If Marcus's story teaches us anything, it's that the fight for racial justice is far from over. But it also teaches us that change is possible. The victory in the courtroom didn't just come from a chance piece of evidence. It came from the tireless work of those who refused to accept the status quo. Sheila's courage, the bravery of the man who stepped forward with the truth, and Karen's unwavering belief in Marcus's innocence were all crucial parts of the puzzle. Marcus's journey didn't end with his acquittal. It was merely a beginning of the broader struggle for racial justice, equality, and human dignity. The fight for justice is not just about one person. It's about dismantling systems of oppression, about creating a world where every child, no matter their race, can stand before the law and be treated with fairness, respect, and equality. If we are to create that world, we must continue to act. We must continue to demand change, to challenge the status quo, and to fight for a future where the struggles of people like Marcus are no longer a reality. The work is long, and the road is hard, but as Sheila and Marcus have shown us, there is always hope, and with that hope there is power. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of a chapter in Marcus's life, it became clear that this moment wasn't just about one young man receiving the justice he deserved. It was about something much bigger. The story of Marcus and his mother is the story of every Black person who has been wrongfully judged, every family torn apart by a biased system, and every community that has lived in the shadow of inequality. But, just as Marcus stood up to face the injustice that sought to define him, we must stand up against the systems that continue to perpetuate this inequality. We are all part of the story, and it is on all of us to make sure the ending is one that reflects our shared commitment to justice, fairness, and compassion. You, the viewers, have the power to shape the future. The road to justice may be long, but it's not one we walk alone. Every time we speak out, every time we support one another, and every time we push for change, we take one step closer to a world where equality is not a distant dream, but a reality. This story, Marcus's victory, is just a glimpse of what is possible when we refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. But the work doesn't stop here. There are countless people out there who still need our support, whose voices still need to be heard. This isn't just Marcus's fight, it's our fight. It's a fight for equality, a fight for kindness, a fight for justice. This isn't just about one case, one courtroom, or one community. It's about all of us coming together to create a world where no one has to face the world with fear in their heart because of the color of their skin. So, what can you do? First, share this story. Let Marcus's experience be a light that reaches those who need it most. Talk about it. Share it with your friends, your families, your social networks. Use your voice to amplify stories like Marcus's and keep the conversation going. Next, take action. Support organizations that are working to fight systemic racism and inequality. Donate to causes that are providing legal support, education, and resources to marginalized communities. Volunteer your time. Attend protests and rallies. Write letters to lawmakers demanding changes to policies that perpetuate injustice. Speak up, not just when it's convenient, but when it's necessary. If you don't know where to start, there are countless resources and organizations that can help guide you. Educate yourself on the history of racial inequality. Learn about the disparities in the justice system, and understand the challenges that Black and other marginalized communities face every day. The more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to create the change we seek. But even beyond these actions, the most important thing we can do is to show kindness, empathy, and solidarity in our daily lives. It's easy to think that justice is something that only happens in courtrooms or political offices, but justice begins with each of us, in the way we treat others. It's in how we listen to the voices that are often silenced, how we stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. The fight for justice isn't easy, and there will be setbacks. There will be moments when we feel like our efforts aren't enough, but just like Marcus, we can't give up. We can't afford to. Change happens when we show up, when we refuse to let the injustices of the past define the future, and when we fight together as one. We can all be a part of a world that does better, a world that doesn't turn a blind eye to injustice, a world where every person is valued and treated with dignity, a world where the color of someone's skin no longer determines their fate. So I ask you today, how will you stand? How will you make sure that justice is more than just a word? How will you be the change we so desperately need? It begins with us, right now. It begins with you. And it starts with taking that first step toward a future where every story, like Marcus's, ends with hope, justice, and equality for all. Thank you for being part of this journey. Let's keep fighting. Let's keep speaking out. Let's keep making a difference. Together, we can build a world where justice is not just a victory, it's a guarantee.